and continuing with the theme of Agentic AI and generative AI risk management over the last few weeks. I'm excited to announce that we are going to start our first cohort on generative AI and Agentic AI focused risk management, considering that it's the age of 26 too. And there have been a lot of changes and also a lot of discussions in the industry on how do you manage risk. And also, technology is just evolving so fast in the last few years. And the last year in particular, people weren't really talking about agentic AI and aspects of building various kinds of systems. It was mostly in a laboratory setting, and it was primarily focused on building out prototypes. But we're seeing a lot of use cases in production. Things which we were experimenting are now seeing the light of day, and we have actual users using these systems. So which means that as an organization which is building, validating, deploying, you had to figure out like how do we address all these. And that's the work we are focused on over the last many years, but also the work is becoming more and more important in the last few months as we have seen regulatory changes, but also technological evolution. So I would like to take an opportunity today to introduce some of the things we are talking about and how we are thinking in the context of building out a framework to address these specific kinds of risks. And then I'm also going to briefly tell about the course. I know I've been getting a lot of questions over the weekend on what the course entails and is it too late to register and what are we going to be doing over the 4 weeks. So I'm going to briefly introduce the course to you. I know we have a couple of participants in the course also dialed in today, so I would like to take that opportunity to kind of just briefly tell you about the course. By no way I plan to kind of claim that I know everything. These are built upon the discussions we have been having in the field over many, many years, but also the learning aspects has been in some ways driven by the community, because I work with a lot of peers who are kind of working on building out different kinds of frameworks. But in addition, I'm also learning from you all, as people talk about the various challenges and bring up questions in these forums, in these webinars, we get an opportunity to think about it, because these are the kinds of challenges which you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And it's only through collective learning we can basically establish the profession in the direction it's going, considering all the technological evolutions. So with that said, just a couple of logistical things. I'm going to use the next 30 minutes or so to briefly tell about some of the things we have been talking about with respect to the framework. And then I'm going to pause for a little bit to just make sure that if there are any questions, but then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the course and answer any questions either regarding the course or with respect to the presentations today. And again, all these slides will be shared on Q-Skill Bridge. So if you want to kind of check out some of our other presentations we have had over the last 3 or 4 months, you're welcome to just go into Q-Skill Bridge, and all those slides are available for free. You will be able to download and also watch the recordings there. So I'll post some links later during the session, and if you have signed up for this webinar over Zoom, you will get an email with a formal link on where you can go in and join. Okay, so that's kind of the plan for today. So let me share my screen and get going. So as this semester, or rather like last semester at Northeastern University, I had an opportunity to teach a course primarily on the building side of things. We basically decided that it's time for us to take 13 weeks to build out an entire system focusing on getting financial data, building out the requisite data cleansing process, building out data pipelines, leveraging large language models to build out chatbots, leveraging agentic AI to build out different kinds of agents to do different things, and then think about deploying them. And when you deploy them in a test setting, what are the considerations? And when you deploy them in a production settings, what are the considerations? So more or less, we were kind of mimicking the first line of defense activities, wherein you're taking a concept and thinking about the design requirements and building out the constructs on how do you actually build out the entire thing from scratch. So over a period of 13 weeks, we were able to like build the whole thing. I also got an opportunity to kind of teach a course at George Mason University in the Responsible AI program. And more or less, the course ran in parallel. It was a 13-week course, and this course primarily focused on artificial intelligence risk management. And here, we primarily focused on the various facets of risks, which you have to think about when you're building out GenAI based systems, which involved a lot of research, both in the context of how do you define the complexity of a model and what all the kinds of risk management aspects we have to think about when we're building out such a system. What are the different kinds of testing that needs to be done? How do you validate these models? What kind of evidence do you construct along the way? How do you document these aspects? So we kind of took a four-phased approach. So initially, we basically look at the governance frameworks, the legislatory requirements, and the various regulations which are out there at this point in time. How do you think about structuring the roles and responsibilities and the governance aspects? Then we looked at like the various facets of risk. You think about explainability, you think about fairness, you think about reliability and robustness and security, various facets on what are the various things you have to think about, both from the context of machine learning models from a traditional sense, but also thinking about Gen AI based models. Then we kind of did a deep dive on the various risk management aspects and the evals associated with Gen AI based products. And then we did a whole capstone on how do you build end-to-end systems. And we kind of took out the whole concept, which was just on paper, to think about building out governance frameworks and evidence packs and thinking about how you could communicate the risk assessments to end users. So the last 3 to 4 months or so, I've been kind of building this dual track thought process on what does it take to take a concept to deployment in my Northeastern core setting, and what does it take to think about a regulatory framework and then operationalize it from a GenAI. So many of the things we are going to be discussing over the next few weeks as a part of my course will be based on the things I've been doing over the past 4 months or so. So if you see new concepts in here and ask me like, where did that come from? It's just I'm going to wing the answer by saying like, there isn't a published recommendation. In fact, if you look at SR 26.2, it's very skeletal, and it even explicitly carves out Gen AI and Agentic AI based systems. So many of the things we're talking about are discussions with peers, things about like what's the best practices you could operationalize from other areas, and how do you think about bringing those concepts together. Now, people by this time, the April 26th was when this particular document was released, and it's been a couple of months, and most people are still assimilating like what does it actually mean in the context of whether these risks needs to be bucketed as model risks, or you have to think about the risks associated with Gen AI as either operational risk, compliance risk, third-party risk, technology risk, conduct risk, cybersecurity risk. So there are a lot of facets of risk which needs to be thought about. So you can't just basically think about risk management for Gen AI and Agentic AI products as only from the model governance trend. So even if you are in a second line of defense function and you are currently in a model risk based, holding the responsibility as a model risk professional, you will be working with technology, you will be working with operations, you will be working with cybersecurity, because there are multiple facets you have to think, and hats you have to wear, because the risks are not just contained in the model. Now, people in the last few years have been realizing that there are two ways in which GenAI is potentially going to help them. One, in the context of productivity, which means that I don't need to kind of do all the things from soup to nuts. I could basically outsource some of the things I've been doing and leverage GenAI based tools to accelerate my processes. So think of it as like, can I use OCR to extract content from various documents and then build out pipelines so that I could organize them in particular ways from a data engineering task. But then you could also think about in the context of chatbots, wherein I'm only able to support an operation 9 to 5, but outside of those business hours, if people have questions about their accounts, people have questions about resetting passwords, can I enable chatbots so that they could basically help me in terms of efficiency? But also thinking about like call trees, wherein people's first interface would be a chatbot, and then you can decide based on the kinds of questions they're asking whether they need to go and approach a human to get the answers, or will the chatbot-based answers be sufficient? And we are also seeing a lot of productivity enhancement. Like, I do not have time to read a 75-page financial report released yesterday. I need to get the highlights, but I also need questions or other answers for these specific questions. Can I use a tool leveraging GenAI so that I can pass in a report and get back the summary in the format I need so that I can basically reconcile my understanding with what actually happened? Right. And then also producing evidence. So if I'm going to be like, taking crib notes on various things, you probably have seen that already in operations at your doctor's offices. Whenever I go to my doctor, I usually see my doctor bring up his her device saying, this is going to be my note taker, and it'll basically consolidate all the notes. And most of the medical professionals are now like note taking and writing it as evidence for insurance purposes is such a hard task, especially with our context switching on whether we are listening to patients or whether we are doing things. So basically, I would like a tool to do it. Similar operations in financial services, we are thinking about leveraging these kinds of tools to summarize documents for us, personalize documents, and we are building various things. Now, we are also realizing that the interfaces we are creating may not be something which we can basically kind of always have a human in the loop. And then we are thinking about, well, what in case we delegate these operations to agents, wherein we could think about aspects of reasoning, planning. Yesterday, for Father's Day, I took my daughter to the MIT Museum, which is a couple of miles away from my place in here. And there's a whole section on AI. And one of the things which kind of caught my attention, I'll see if I can post it on LinkedIn later. It was basically the definition of planning and reasonings. And these are like the things which people have been doing for the past 30 to 40 years in terms of academic research. But now we have the tools which tries to mimic some of those behaviors. So when we think about mimicking those behaviors, now we are kind of, uh, the reason why I brought up MIT was because like you're thinking at a different level. We're not thinking in terms of operations. We have to think about, well, what does reasoning actually mean? What does planning actually mean? How do we validate a plan? How do we think about reproducing something which is a thought process which has been organized, saying that this is the most optimal way of doing things? So it kind of goes beyond the thought process of, well, I'm going to delegate everything to my brain, and if it's not efficient, that's fine. I'm going to take a little longer. If I'm incorrect, I may take another shot at it and repair it. That's not going to be the case how we design machines. When we're designing machines, we are thinking about articulating our thought process, building out our plans, making sure that we validate them so that we can productionize them in scale. So this requires a completely different process. And the same thing goes with our interfaces with multiple enterprise data sets, right? So we now have so much data. In the last 15 or 20 years or so, we started out by defining what big data is. Guess what? We were collecting, we weren't doing anything with it, and always the complaint was all big data projects are a failure because we've been collecting so much and we're not doing anything. Today, we have the opportunity to do something about it because we have all these data sets and we need to build those connectors so that we can get access to the data. We are collecting data in real time in various operations. We are collecting data over time on the interactions. The internet is generating more data than we can consume. So we have the ability to connect, but we got to be strategic with it. Like, what are the right kinds of data sets? How do we trust the data? How do we make sure that the data we got is actually accurate? What kind of validation do we need to incorporate? And then thoughts about automating the process itself, which is to say, in the past, we used to build those connections, draw it as a flowchart, and basically say, this is how I intend to do things. Humans, go do this. Machines, you go do this. But now we have the ability to take an articulated plan on how to go about doing something step by step and converting that into code. I was able to like generate a whole application last week by just specifying my thoughts in a methodical way. And all I had to do was just articulate what I wanted to do and basically have my coding agents define the plan on how to be developed, the test harnesses that needs to be created, and how to operationalize the code. So guess what? The first line of defense is no longer writing code from scratch. They are actually generating code using LLMs, which means that you are now validating the code written by an LLM. You're also validating the process in which the code was written by the development team. So it's adding multiple layers of complexity. And we have to think about like multi-step workflows. So the age we are living in, though we enjoy all the benefits of all the fun tools we are working with, it's also adding multiple layers of complexity which needs to be thought about. And obviously, that's the reason why we are kind of shifting from a regulatory mindset to an industry specific mindset, because the regulatory mindset was regulation defines SR 11.7, so this is what we intend to do. Let's operationalize it. Let's kind of make sure that the regulators are happy, and we basically build out all the tenets and we're done, right? So SR 11.7 was replaced by 26.2, which carved out Agentic AI and GenAI, saying in the future we were going to release one more document or something which is associated specifically with these concepts. But we also want to kind of narrow down the scope of what actual MRM means. So now you have to think about, well, what happens with all these agents and tools we are building and integrating as a part of our workflow? Do we kind of, just because we are not obligated regulatory wise, do we stop doing risk management on it, or do we actually need to do more because we don't have a guideline? So we got to start building out the frameworks. And you also have to think about, well, we are working with real time, we are delegating it to agents, we are basically having non-determinism baked into our pipelines. We do not expect the same answer to come back. So what does it mean with respect to risk? So how do we think about runtime behavior and access and actions, etc.? And then the control aspects of it, like, what layers of controls and governance should we be putting into our enterprise? And how do we think about monitoring and accountability? So what my perspective is, we won't have answers as individuals working in a company thinking about like, okay, I'm going to sit at a coffee shop today and basically sketch out like what needs to be done. Or I'm going to hire a consulting company to come in and then they basically will draw the template for us, or wait for a regulator to basically issue a guideline. So I think I'm more interested in kind of figuring out what's working for our peers, because this problem is not unique to me. Every company working in a similar domain is kind of working on the same problem. So how can we have a practitioner-led governance blueprint for financial institutions so that we can bring in the peers, the experts who have thought through this over many, many years and have established a footprint, but also with the new challenges, how can we gravitate towards an accepted solution which kind of addresses many of the things which we probably cannot address in isolation. So the architecture we're kind of thinking about, I mean, this is basically a boilerplate. There isn't like a prescriptive guideline to say, oh, you're building a chatbot, use this particular template. Oh, you're building this, use this particular. There's no way you can do this. The medical analogy there is, doctors do not have manuals written down for every particular problem a human can have. It's impossible for someone in a medical profession to basically have like a prescriptive approach for each disease they see, right? So they basically have a framework on how to address particular things, and they go through a process of research, evaluation, addressing various things. And for certain things, they would gravitate towards process. So for example, if there is a particular skin related thing which goes through a thing like you got to get this eval, that you got to get a biopsy, you got to do these tests. If this comes out in a particular way, you got to do this, else do this. So that clear definition will be adopted throughout the practice, throughout the system, so that if somebody has that particular condition, you'll go through it. right? But it cannot be done for everything. So we will try to find out like ways in which you can work with specific kinds of problems. But again, you got to think about in the context of framework and keep it flexible enough, at least in today's day and age, to make sure that it's extendable, it can be adaptable to your specific requirements, right? So if you think about agentic AI, so here are like the control planes you got to think about, because yeah, you do not have dependencies which are clearly defined. It's an architectural choice. You may have thought about using a particular platform. You may have thought about ways in which data comes in. What kinds of tools are you going to be using alongside with your application? What aspects of behaviors are you delegating to agents? Is there a reasoning behavior? Can you leverage some best practices? And then also, this is not going to be deploy and forget, right? So you got to be thinking about runtime monitoring. Like, how do I know my model is actually working? You build a chatbot, you deploy it, 95% of the calls request a human to come in and address the question, means all the chatbots you built is useless. You may have built out all the perfect validation, you know the right answers, you got everything tested. If you are monitoring your application, and most of the times, the objective function you have optimized is something you got to think about, because it's not just a technical product, it's about like how does it affect your business, right? And then ultimately we own the risk as humans, right? But it's not going to be, machines are not going to be basically taking all the risk. So what is the residual risk we know is there, and how do we address those risks, and what are the repercussions if those risks are addressed properly? So the way I'm kind of thinking of structuring this is in the context of tiering. We're all familiar with risk tiers. So thinking about like some of the use cases we already have in place. So can we tier these applications so that we could think about, oh, see, these are productivity agents. So if you're doing like things like summarization or documenting or drafting various documents, if you're building an internal search engine, meeting prep, I want to compute a note so that when I meet my client, I have all my transactions with this client over last period of time. What are their interests? What am I going to be discussing? So all those needs to be thought about as productivity agents. Then the analytical co-pilot. So this is where you're trying to automate some of the analytics. So many times we want dynamic dashboards, we want earnings reviews, we want the models to be documented, research to be consolidated. So these are kinds of what are called as analytical co-pilots, wherein you are thinking about, well, it's kind of needed at this point in time. We don't need it all the time, but I have a process wherein I can automate certain things and then look at these, because like when the earnings change, when the time moves on and we have other things to be done, we may have to modulate these systems again. And then workflow agents. So this is where the drudgery, right? Like wherein I'm expected to do this from a regulatory perspective. It's not going to generate money for the bank or for my organization. I got to do it. Think like a suspicious activity report. How many of us will be thinking about like, oh, this is going to generate a lot of money if we are going to be creating all the reports and filing them accurately, and we got to throw in a bunch of $1 million for that particular project, right? So this is where I think some of the automation kind of can potentially help KYC, SARs. So these are the kinds of things wherein you could potentially say, okay, can I build workflow agents wherein it drafts certain things, and then a human comes in and looks at all the connections and reviews the data and say, okay, you know what, I can do my due diligence and ensure that everything is in place, but I'm making the ultimate judgment whether it can go or it needs to be further modulated, right? And then decision influencing agents, which is where you could potentially think about portfolio construction or risk rating or underwriting or factor construction. So these are things wherein you are creating IP within your organization based on the culture and the genes of your organization. And then you're thinking about, well, I have a process. This is how I do things. Can I potentially embody the thought process into an agent, which can potentially help it out? So it requires different level of validation and the thought process, but you can kind of tier those as decision influencing agents. And then action executing agents. So these are the kinds of things wherein you are going to be saying, okay, I'm going to be generating code in a particular way, and this is how I'm going to be deploying it. So will I be able to take it from design through deployment, or have design, initial prototyping, sandboxing, thinking about testing it out in a very specific way, and then have a human gate, and then think about deployment or automating the whole thing. So those are all things based on the kinds of applications you had to think about. So as you can see, the use cases and the risk tiers are going to be different. So the goal for you is to make sure that whatever inventory of use cases you have can be appropriately defined so that the risks are properly tiered, so that you put in the right level of resources for the right kinds of applications. So this is just to kind of put your thought around, like, how can you think about governance as and some of the questions obviously are like things you have already been exposed to and you have already thought of, but just to kind of put them into specific buckets. So you had to think about materiality, like what is an agentic AI system and when does it become material, right? The boundary, and you have to define, like, well, I can potentially use 26.2 for these particular cases. And if it doesn't cover these use cases, how should I potentially cover, right? Controls. So, what are the minimum level of controls we want to make sure that it actually clears before I can potentially, deploy this. And the validation. So when you think about like non-deterministic multi-step workflows or systems, what does validation actually mean? And then the ownership, like, when you got to have an assigned owner for all the residual risks. So what kinds of risks are out there? Who owns this residual risk? And, how can you potentially leverage the artifacts and the logs to think about, applying those principles towards addressing specific kinds of risks? And then you also had to think about the various facets, right? The risk taxonomy, like, as I mentioned, we have multiple ways in which we can tier our applications, and you may develop your own taxonomy based on how you think about risks associated with your organization. If you are, a large bank, you probably have large teams of people. You could potentially delegate certain kinds of tiers to specific groups. But if you're a very small organization, you're working with like 4 use cases, you don't need to create an entire taxonomy. You just need to bucket them as per your protocols and how you're going to be defining them. And then the governance principles, like, how do you think about, the transition from SR 11.7 to 26.2? Do you have to think about building in different kinds of things within your organization? Do you need to leverage external expertise too, because you may not be familiar with all the key aspects of, GenAI? And in fact, some of the courses we are doing, when we do it in a private setting for corporate clients. So those are the discussions we have, because many times model risk professionals haven't studied computer science, or aspects wherein they can easily articulate the difference between reasoning and planning and all the agentic AI related terminologies. They are also grappling with these concepts, and they are wondering like whether they should own the whole workflow, and should they be kind of getting an additional help if they need to understand what has actually happened. And then the control architecture, right? So which is to say, what kinds of evidence do we need? How do we control the whole process? And then the validation aspect. So what does validation actually mean? What is our eval checklist? And that again is not the same one like what we had for traditional statistical models. Back in the day when I used to validate models for Citigroup and other companies, we basically had real clear protocols, and this was the eval list we would potentially follow. But with non-deterministic systems, you have to think about like what does an eval mean from the scratch. And then the use cases, because the use cases I presented, it's June 2026 edition. Come back in July or August, that slide would have changed. People are now realizing there are so many more use cases they can accomplish. The technology is changing so fast. So the next cohort we do will probably have multiple different use cases. So you got to think about, this is not a static problem. This is like we have kind of started an engine. When electricity came about, people didn't say, okay, now that we have electricity, we don't need to kind of think about things. Like electricity started the whole revolution. And the same way, when you have agentic AI and Gen AI systems, which is kind of coming into enterprises, it's going to start a new revolution. So you had to start thinking about a framework rather than just specific use cases. And then it means that we are going to be delegating a lot of things to vendors. We cannot do everything soup to nuts. So we have to think about like, well, what does the vendor actually own? What is their IP? They may not be able to disclose it just because from a competitive perspective, they have a secret sauce and they won't be able to relieve it. But they also need to be disclosing the process. How are they actually collecting the data? Are we kind of all relying on kind of the same vendor models, which is going to expose us to risks if this vendor goes down, if that particular technology is not available, or if multiple people are accessing the same technology and that particular technology wasn't built up to scale because they didn't reveal their risk management practices. So all those things you have to think about. And then finally, internally, we have to think about, well, obviously we need the budgets. We can't do everything, 24/7. So we got to think about the budgets, what aspects of it are allocated to humans and what aspects are allocated to technology. So I used to teach a course called algorithmic marketing many years ago. And when we spoke to customers, they were in the marketing profession, and we asked them like, how do you do your budget allocation? So they were talking about like advertising, for example, right? So when you think about advertising, people would say, oh, this is the amount of advertising we do in radio, this is the advertising we do on television. And when the internet was kind of new, people were thinking like, we have like a 3 or 4% allocation towards spend on online ads. And guess what? Today, that's a major portion. A lot of people are spending a lot of money on online advertising compared to traditional advertising of radio and television. Similarly, today, we are probably thinking like humans are going to be the major budget for all the systems we are putting together, but we will need to allocate on tokens and systems and technology. And that proportion may change over time, which means that the management needs to be, first of all, aware of what are they actually investing in and what to expect when they are kind of making those investments, who owns those risks, what are the structural aspects when we are thinking about cross-functional teams coming together and putting together an AI risk council, what are their responsibilities, who has the override mechanism, and all those levels need to be thought about, right? So I have a bunch of questions which I always think about, and I'm just going to talk about some, briefly, which we discuss further in the course. And many a times, these are things which are thought-provoking, but not necessarily having like a B, C, D answer, and we choose one answer as the answer, and it's going to constantly change over time. But I would like you to start thinking in this direction if you are kind of working in this area. The materiality aspect is something which is extremely important, and you have to think about, well, you have a co-pilot versus an agentic AI system. How does it actually change? So, are we thinking about model capability, criticality? Who are the end users? What kinds of data sets are we working with? Tools is a major thing. A lot of times, the traditional tools weren't really having exposure to AI-based tools, but now with MCP servers, with access to various tools, now we are kind of delegating and making it cross-functional across multiple systems. And also what kind of exposures. If you're automating a lot of things, it's not just that you're getting the workflow optimization and the cost benefits because of streamlining operations. You are going to be exposed to risks both on the monetary front and the technology front too. So what kinds of things need to be thought about? And the client impact, right? So, multiple times I hear people not satisfied with internet or chatbot-based customer service is because they want that human touch. They are paying for that human touch. So it may save you costs, but if you're going to be losing customers over time, that's something to be thought about. Like, what levels of service can we create so that you can set the right kinds of expectations. And then also now the lines are blurring. You do not have clear-cut responsibility. So you have to think about, you know, um, productivity usage, analytical support, decision influence, action execution. So all these are things you have to start thinking about. Now, the second part is something you probably are all grappling. Like, you are thinking about, well, this is 26.2, but you have to think about what can I build upon based on already things which I already have. You have an established model risk function, you have operational risk, you have technology risk, you are addressing cyber risk in particular ways. Now with agentic AI touching multiple facets, how do you kind of, combine those frameworks or basically add a layer so that you build out those connectivities, right? And then you have to think about do I create multiple inventories or think about it as use cases wherein, I used to use a regression model. Now this regression model has been replaced with a traditional machine learning model. But then I may also have a use case wherein I'm potentially leveraging an agentic AI model. So does it all kind of extend in one inventory, or you need to think about LLM and agentic AI use cases as its own separate inventory? And then, how do we communicate this across multiple organizations? Because if it's traditional model risk and we have our, known peeps, if you will, we know what are the documents to communicate. But if we have multiple organizations having touch points, how do we make sure that we communicate all those properly? Because you must have gone to budget meetings. Technology takes a budget, model risk takes a budget, and then everybody starts discussing. So we have to think about, like, how do we communicate to the boards? How do we communicate to the various committees on what does evidence of a safe deployment mean? Now, couple of things which goes into the operational side of things. We have to start thinking about, what can an agent do? Because an agent technologically can do multiple things, but is it the right thing to do to delegate something for an agent to go access the data, call various tools, potentially write code, automatically deploy the code? Does it need to automatically respond to customer queries? So all those are control layers you have to start building in. And that's where you have to start thinking about processes, because it's not just software development, building it out and testing. You got to maybe think about it as well. I want to test this on a set of users. So I may have to think about an A/B test wherein I build a model and I deploy it in a sandbox setting, but I expose this to a few users and see if it actually works. If it doesn't, if the experience is not good, we are seeing that there are so many unknowns we are uncovering, put a kill switch, kill that particular thing, iterate over it, and then build out new. So you got to start thinking about various aspects. And then you also have, everybody has an MCP interface nowadays. You go to Snowflake, you go to MATLAB, you go to any tool, they'll expose you to an MCP interface. So what does that mean? Is it just a bridge or a bridge with controls? So you got to start thinking about, like, what can my tools access, and to what level of comfort are we having when we delegate certain things to various kinds of tools. And ultimately it comes down to we defining our logging architecture, like, what kind of evidence do we collect, what kind of traces do we collect. But it's also cumbersome. When I was talking, and the reason why I love my teaching jobs at universities is I don't have to deal with a budget. If something goes bad, students are going to tell me, like, look, this isn't going right. Maybe we should address this, and it's in a research setting. It's a very safe environment, and I cannot do those kinds of experiments in a commercial setting, because every time it goes down to the ROI question and the risk question, and we do not have the bandwidth to address everything before we can get started. But in an academic setting, it's a little more easier to get things going and to bring out that thought process. And many times, you've heard of this term AI slop. When we start generating artifacts, AI can generate a lot of artifacts. It can even make it look very beautiful. And what does that mean? Are you going to be generating for generation's sake, but also defining what actually means? And then how can you even review it? Say, oh, throw it as an LLM as a judge, take a report generated by an LLM and throw it to another LLM and let it do the due diligence. Frankly, that's not going to work. You got to build in the right kinds of constructs and make sure that you have a tractable problem. But ultimately, you have limited time and budget and focus. So you need to make sure that whatever you're creating aligns with what you can do reasonably and pragmatically. And then the big question of validation. So when I've spent hours and hours discussing when traditional ML came out, wherein what is the model, what does validation for this actually mean? And now we are throwing in a lot of technological innovations into the equation, be it requirement augmented generation, or even a simple PDF parser, or an access to a particular tool. What are the things which could potentially go wrong? Is an end user. You've all heard about problems wherein Rufus, Amazon's chatbot, when it got introduced for the first time, people could throw in a partial differential equation and ask a question about a faucet, and it would answer both questions. Even though the design was meant only to answer questions about faucets, the guardrails basically was supporting multiple questions. It may be humorous and it's something worth remembering, but what in case someone you provide an interface to a database and the only thing you thought about was access to say that I want to make sure that I can connect to this database and run a SQL query. And my testing was to ensure that I can run a query against a particular database, get back my results. Guess what? You may be able to ask anything using text and it could get a text to SQL conversion, execution, and the results back to the user. Huge privacy risk. So how do you address all those? Would you consider that in the adversarial prompting testing? Do you need to define those? All the questions which are still very open and to be addressed. And then finally, the residual risk, because you may be able to try and contain many of the risks and try to document it, provide guidelines, even have human in the loop. But does that actually mean that you're covering for everything? And what does accountability mean in that particular stage? I'm pretty sure no one is going to go and say, I do not like electricity. I can't control whether I can have a shock or not in my, not in my house. So I'm only going to live with traditional fuel sources, which does not involve electricity. That's not the state we can live with AI. AI is going to penetrate every facet of what we are doing, either intentionally, wherein you are directly applying AI, or you're using products which are being used or which have been developed using AI or leveraging AI behind the scenes without you knowing. So you will be exposed to AI in some shape or form. So what does it mean when you think about building it on your own enterprise is a question you got to answer. So I've given you enough to tell you what keeps you awake at night, but I would love to hear more from you because this is something not only from a complexity perspective, but also from a pragmatism perspective. You can only do so much. And what does that mean? And what will keep you awake at night? Because we talked about the technical term residual risk, but the things which keep you at night are the ones wherein you do not have answers yet, and you would love to get answers so that you can get a little bit of peace of mind when you operationalize these products. Okay, so that's kind of the thing I had. Again, just to tell you, we are actually starting a 4-week cohort starting tomorrow. So 3 hours tomorrow, and then 4 weeks, 3 hours each. We are going to be discussing these concepts at length. I have all the materials. We have slides. We have lab, notebooks so that you can get an understanding of what actually is done. My goal is not to say after 4 weeks you will be thorough and complete, because I am not thorough and I am not complete. So you will be kind of at least asking more questions and you will be understanding things a little more clearly after the next 4 weeks. But it's for you to determine, how can you use those 4 weeks to kind of build upon what we are going to be discussing in the classroom. And then my mode of teaching, just building up on my academic experience and my working with the industry, has been learning by doing, because it's not easy for you to just be an armchair expert and say, I have answers to all the problems, but I don't know how to execute them. Even if you are in an MRM role wherein you have never built a model before, just the experience of you building something will expose you to the challenges of what all the things which needs to be thought about. So we have a platform we have built in-house called Q-Skill Bridge, which we will use so that people who have already registered to the course already have gotten some materials. So we'll have some pre-work, some labs, so that you can operationalize many of these settings. I also am a big believer of learning from the experts. Many of these experts, I have the pleasure and privilege of knowing them over many, many years, and they are real rock stars in their professions. And as you can see, Uday has a PhD in natural language processing, has written multiple books. So he's going to be kicking off a guest lecture this week. And then Scott and I, we got a chance to meet each other when I was doing a course many years ago, and he was setting up infrastructure, but he gave a couple of talks to my GMU class on the challenges and some of the work he had been doing in an enterprise setting. So we'll have an opportunity to learn from him. And everybody knows Agus Sugianto, dear friend of mine. I really respect him, and I exchange messages with him all the time. And he's kind of an LLM himself, if you will, wherein he can basically create content and build out frameworks and get the industry to talk about it. So he's going to be doing a workshop. So he's going to be doing a 2-hour workshop to basically talk about some of the frameworks and operationalize some of the frameworks. He's given a couple of guest lectures, but he's going to do a full-fledged workshop in July. And then Jacob Kossoff, who's at Bank of America. I got to know Jacob when he was at Regions Bank, and he's at Bank of America and he's doing his amazing work. And he's going to share some of his experiences on working with GenAI. So I'm a big believer in getting into a learning mode and learning from the experts, but I'm also a big believer in peer learning. And here are some of the organizations who have already signed up for the course, and it'll be an opportunity for people to discuss it in a cohort setting to understand some of the challenges, so that we can make sure that we learn from each other. Because ultimately, we want to create something which works for everybody and not just coming from an ivory tower of either a regulator or some academic who can potentially give out like what needs to be done, even if they have never done anything in the enterprise. So we have 4 sessions coming up, and just wanted to make sure that everybody is aware. If you wanted to extend the learning what you're having today into an extended session, I'm going to throw out a link in the chat window if you're still interested in considering this. Ultimately, even if you don't take this course, that's fine. I'd love for you to engage with us in a conversation, either through email or LinkedIn, or if you have built out something which could be of use for the community, please do share, because as a community of people who really care about what we do, we want to make sure that the like-minded people kind of come together and set the stage for how do we address these challenges over time, so that we can all benefit from collective learning, but also contribute back to the community. So I think that's all I had. I'm going to stop my screen sharing, and we'll use the rest of the time to answer some questions. So let me see if I can answer some of the questions. So we have a couple of questions, and I'll try to see if I can summarize some of it. So how is the financial industry approaching risk management for GenAI, Agentic AI, expanding model risks to manage these cross-functional risks, or how an AI risk function on the top where model risk function is engaged when model risk becomes non-material? So that's a very good question, and I think that's kind of the questions I posed in the last 5 slides or so, more or less are the kinds of questions the industry is asking. I wish I could say that there is this particular document which covers everything. In fact, I just finished my book on AI and risk management and sent it to my publisher Wiley last week. And over time, I've been researching what the prudential regulations are kind of talking about. What is the Singapore government putting out? What is Canadian government putting out? And what is FSB putting out? So there have been a lot of multiple, different kinds of efforts being thought about on how to address some of these risks. But again, it's an evolving field. As I said, there are 2 ways in which you can address this. One is learn from the experts and learn from peers. So that's the only way wherein we can kind of collectively come up with some way of understanding these challenges. The second question is how the accountabilities have shifted between first line and second line as we talk about governance with respect to Agentic AI. Are 2 lines of people still looking to validate at the AI use case level? So great question. In fact, we had a AI roundtable a few weeks back in Boston, and we were talking to many of the people in the second line of defense. A lot of second line defense people are now sitting with the first line of defense people to um, think about like how the design was actually done. It's no longer that there are these silos wherein we are clearly defined, this is where the boundary is. We are collaborating heavily with multiple groups, not just like the developers, but also technology risk and operational risk, cyber risk, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to think holistically when it comes down to these applications. You cannot just basically think of it as this was what was defined pre-Gen AI, and we'll continue using the same model. We even had these open questions. Over time, will there even be an organization called just as model risk, or will it change or morph into something completely different? We don't know the answer yet. But in today's day and age, since we already have an established practice, the goal is to see how much can that practice expand, or maybe even delegate to other organizations as we see, the need be for various kinds of challenges. Couple more questions along the way. So continuous validation is key with kinds of Rails we can use, validate YAML successfully and deploy in production. Yes, as I said, monitoring is an extremely important step, and continuous validation is also going to be important. But again, the use cases will require specific kinds of guardrails. You cannot just basically take a guardrail library and throw it at every problem. So you got to think about like what guardrails are required for specific use cases. So yeah, so I think that's just a comment by Abhishek Chaudhary. So will you suggest having two LLMs pitted against each other to get consistent answer from them? People have been experimenting with LLM as a judge, and sometimes it works. When actually I was writing my book, I actually had draft chapters, and I would actually throw in my draft chapters and saying, wear the hat of an editor and look at various problems in my particular draft. And it was able to find like, multiple things, like the way I was using English, the way I was, looking at citations, references here and there, and it gave me some really good practical suggestions. However, I don't know if I can say that those were consistent, but I was able to, again, experiment with some of those options. And again, I don't have either feeling whether it's completely useless or completely useful. You got to determine, and maybe that's something you have to think about. Like anytime maybe an LLM generates a document, you could potentially have another LLM look it over and see whether it's based on the specifics you have already defined. How would you rate those? That way you get a level of confidence on if another LLM has reviewed the output of the first LLM and is only confident 4 on a 10, maybe you should look at it more closely compared to that of, well, it was really consistent with the information which it was supposed to extract. So I have a 9 or a 10, maybe you go more confident. Again, those are things you have to think about operationalizing it. So Paul, you had a question about one question my organization is grappling with is, when does GenAI tool move from being purely referential use case to becoming a key driver for business decisions? So if a human is in the loop and accepts GenAI recommendation 90% of the time, or 80% of the time, when does the authority placed on a GenAI tool make it the key driver for the decision? Relatedly, what are the points of failures for human in the loop? Paul, you're going to be with us for 4 weeks, so we will discuss all these aspects at length. The one thing I'm going to mention in here, I'm not a believer of specific numbers to say that, if it clears a particular threshold, you're good to go kind of thing, because it needs to be use case specific. But you also need to have some kind of objective criteria to say this is when I'm going to, let my decision move from one area to another, right? So the key thought here is ultimately we are going to be making business decisions with this. So you may have to give it a little bit of time to see whether those decisions are actually happening the way we anticipated. If we were thinking about cost savings or revenue generation or productivity enhancements, what are the the criteria I would potentially expect? So is it saving really 10 hours of an engineer's time by doing these kinds of activities? Doesn't matter whether you're able to get it for one project, but over time, is it giving me the benefit? So you may have to start defining new metrics for your specific use cases. Yeah, so I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's something we can discuss over time. So maybe one last question. So how do you address psychophancy of LLMs? Great question. I'm not sure if I am the right person to even answer it, because these are the questions which large LLM providers are actively trying to address. This is something which is obviously you're acknowledging it and you're trying to make sure that you're aware of it as a test. I do see, I mean, I use ChatGPT a lot. I was driving to New Hampshire for a hike over the weekend, and I had my Claude and my ChatGPT on, and was asking questions, getting back answers. But you're right. I mean, in fact, I'm kind of using, no pun intended, some psychophancy in here. Like you will get the answer you're kind of looking for if you do not, preface it with the right kinds of things. So sometimes I actually say, I build a skill file saying things like, you know what, I want the real answer. I don't want it to be sugar coated. I don't want any kind of you trying to, be brutal. The way I communicate with you, you got to communicate back with me. Be direct, be brutal. Do not kind of give me sugar coated answers. And sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't go well, but you got to put in additional aspects to make sure that you're getting back answers you can potentially trust. And many a times you may have to build out, whole suite of question and answers to see whether you're actually getting those things right over time. Last question again, Anshul, can a GenAI model be validated with quantification similar to statistical? In some ways, you could define quantitative metrics, but I don't know whether quantification actually means. So you could have metrics, and that's the whole section we're going to cover as part of the course. So Anshul, join the course and you'll learn more. But over time, these metrics will evolve, and maybe even regulators may ask you to use certain kinds of metrics. But at this point in time, I think you got to start from a use case and then start defining like what would be okay enough for me to go to the next stage. Maybe it is not getting me to that particular point, which means that I may need to have more human in the loop, may have to break the task into multiple subtasks so that I can atomically quantify the outputs for each subtask and then say that I'm confident about this so I can move to my next task. So it's a process. So you cannot just basically define the product and then see if I can define a metric. So you may have to start thinking about, well, how do I chunk my process into multiple sub-processes and atomically validate each one of them so that holistically I can get like a confidence score so that I can deploy my models. So again, it's a process. So I think those are all the what do you call questions we had for the day. Again, I'm connected online, and you probably see me, every few weeks, on either a webinar or other kinds of sessions. Just for interest, I'm going to throw the link to the course. If you're still interested, we're going to shut down registrations for tonight. And people who have registered, looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Otherwise, we will see you all at another session of Quant University's either the AI Spring School, or we're going to start our summer school in the near future. So we'll see you soon. Thanks for your time and see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.